Hello, I'm Cassada, and this is my presentation on the effect of text medium on comprehension. I'm a student at Tunstall High School, and I hope to be attending the University of Virginia this fall to study statistics. I chose this topic because of the growing influence of digital devices in the education system and the influence of COVID-19 on the possibility of future permanent virtual learning. I hope to improve the field of education by expanding the knowledge of how digital reading affects the comprehension level in high-achieving high school students who plan on continuing their education. The text of emphasis will be scientific articles because there was a gap in the field for that text genre. In my research of prior studies, I have found that digital reading tends to be linked to a lower comprehension level. However, this conclusion was based from broad studies, so this conclusion may not be representative for subgroups of the population. Time was the most influential factor, because time could either be limited or measured. The way in which the study manipulated time determined how the results should be analyzed. When time was limited, digital text was linked to a worse comprehension score. When time was measured but not limited, readers spent more time reading digital text than print text, meaning that digital text tends to be ineffective in comparison to print text. Meaning that when analyzing calibration scores, which is when a reader predicts how they perform after reading and answering questions, digital reading had a higher calibration score. This means that reading digitally is linked to a false confidence. The age of the participant can determine how the reader performs. For digital mediums, younger readers tend to have a slightly better performance than their older counterparts. However, the difference could be considered insignificant. Female readers tend to perform better than male readers in comprehension score. The text genre statistically is insignificant, but the difference of narrative text and informative scientific text should be recognized. Narrative text is illustrating a story, while the purpose of scientific text is to give information that the reader will understand and remember. Text format is also important because it affects the readability of the text. The best format for digital text is Rondo Font 12 doublespace. This is so because it makes the text large and spaced out. Unlike digital text, there is no format that is significantly better in the print medium. The demographics of the reader and text should be specific in order to make the most appropriate conclusions for real-world applications. The question that my research is attempting to answer is how does reading digitally affect high school students' comprehension level and confidence when reading informative text? I predicted that digital text will lower the comprehension and calibration scores of the reader. This is supported by my literature review. However, it is possible that there will be no difference between the results of printed and digital text. The variable that I purposely changed is the text medium. This change will or may affect the comprehension calibration score. The control treatment was the printed text. I kept time, text genre, and testing medium constant throughout both the control and experimental treatments. Time was set for 20 minutes. The text genre was scientific, and the participants were given an answer sheet and a paper copy of the questions for both digital and print text. I obtained consent from Dr. Mark Jones and Dr. Bocock to perform my study. I also obtained the consent of Brian Bowles to perform my testing at Tunstall High School. I used text and questions from old release SAT practice questions. I created an answer sheet that asked for the name of the participant, whether the text read was article A or B, a number list for the participant to put their response to each question, and the participants' guess of how many questions they answered correctly. The participants were randomized by the order in which they signed in to the testing site. Of the 32 participants, which consisted of juniors and seniors in government school or AP students at Tunstall High School, odd numbered participants read article A first, while even numbered participants read article B first. After every participant read one article, they read the other article in the different text medium. Every testing session took place at Tunstall High School, either in the library or in a computer lab. I compiled the data into a Google spreadsheet, and I conducted a t-test for both the results for both the comprehension and calibration score. The one sample t-test results show that there was low difference between digital and print text for the scores of these students, while it was significant for the confidence of the students. I used a bar graph to represent the averages of subgroups within the sample. When divided into text medium, the averages of digital and print text was off by 1%. However, when separated by the calibration or the confidence of the participants, digital and print text was off by 6%. The calibration score was higher for both digital and printed text, which shows a general overconfidence by the participants. In conclusion, there was not sufficient evidence to conclude that reading digitally have adverse effects on the reader's performance in comparison to print. However, there was sufficient evidence to conclude that reading digitally falsely increases the reader's performance and confidence in their performance. I believe the failure to reject the null hypothesis is due to the difference of the articles. There was a significant difference between the averages of Article A and Article B, over 10%. The difference between the articles was a major limitation in the study. The conclusion of the test supports the implementation of both digital and print text, except for when the confidence of the reader is vital. The results of the performance of text medium contradict previous literature. The results of the study would be more applicable if the two articles were of similar difficulty. As previously mentioned, the largest limitation was the difference between the two articles. Other limitation would be the limited sample size, which was 32, and the lack of geographical diversity in the sample, as all the participants were from one area. More research needs to be conducted on this topic. Future research should test different text genres, or more specific text genres, different digital devices, and different set of participants' characteristics. Over the course of my research, importantly carrying out my experiment, I've learned that small intervals of progress is better than no progress. I've also learned that being persistent is needed, especially when dealing with participants who have tight schedules. I'd like to thank Dr. Mark Jones and Dr. Joshua Bocock for approving my project. I'd like to thank Mr. Brian Bowles for giving me permission to use Tunstall High School as my testing location. I would like to thank Mr. Tim Bray and Mrs. Linda Yates, Tunstall librarian, for allowing me to use their classroom and library respectively. I would also like to thank my 32 participants for taking their time to be a part of my study. Thank you. Are there any questions? Mrs. Davis.
I'm back to the lit review. What was the average year of your studies that what indicated to you initially? I think I heard you say that it was harder for people to answer questions correctly if they were reading it on the screen as opposed to paper. Did I hear you say that?
Yes. Ms. Davis is asking about the age of my literature review. Most of the articles or the sources were pre-COVID. So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So do you think?
I think after COVID there will be difference to the literature review.
That's really interesting. That's cool.
Mrs. Probst.
Did you happen to take any consideration to the age of the people you were conducting research?
Ms. Probst is asking for the age of the sample. Most of the participants were juniors and seniors.
Okay, but I mean, like, did you take into consideration, would it change if you had included older participants?
Yes,
That's what I meant, sorry.
I think if I take older participants, the results would be more leaning to printed text, than digital text. Mrs. Agnew.
Yes, was there any consideration to the size of the digital, like as opposed to a Chromebook versus a desktop versus larger size monitors?
Yeah, the Ms. Probst is asking, Ms. Agnew is asking about the digital device. I only use desktop computers, so different digital devices was not in the scope of this research. Dr. Brown.
So on confidence, so were you asking the participants how many questions they thought they got right?
Mrs. Brown, Dr. Brown is asking about calibration confidence. That refers to how many questions they think they answered correctly.
And so then how did you run, so did you compare, tell me about that process of doing the confidence thing and the t-test.
So on the answer sheet, I asked them to guess how many questions they answered correctly. Then I graded their questions.
Right.
And then I separate them into two columns to perform the t-test.
Okay, so you're looking at the difference between what they got right versus what they think they got right.
Correct.
Okay.